Hello, and welcome to today's conversation on empowering Africa's most vulnerable, access to energy in complex crisis. My name is Pamela Larg, content writer for ESI Africa, and I would like to mention a few items before we begin. Today's session is brought to you by NORCAP, global provider of expertise to the humanitarian, development, and peace building sectors. At a time when the world is experiencing a health crisis and many are living below the breadline, it has never been more important to meet the need for clean energy. This session is indeed timely and topical, and I encourage our listeners to make the most of their time with our expert panel by asking questions and sharing comments. You can do this by using the live discussion board on the right of your screen. Please feel free to go there now and say hello. If we do not have time to address your question in the live session, we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our expert speakers. We will begin with opening remarks from Steiner Horn, Director of Partnership and Development from NORCAP, and a brief presentation by Lama Garabech, Energy Advisor at NORCAP. This will be followed by a presentation concerning NORCAP's recent report, Empowering Africa's Most Vulnerable. This will be presented by Borja Gomez Rojo and Rebecca Solis del Campo. Please note, a link to this report is available on the platform in the session description. Borja will then introduce our esteemed panelists before moderating the discussion and Q&A. Without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Steiner for opening remarks. Over to you, Steiner.
Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon, everyone. So NORCAP is a global provider of expertise to the humanitarian, development, and peace-building sectors. NORCAP works to protect lives, rights, and livelihoods of affected populations and to strengthen resilience before, after, and during crisis. The world faces a growing number of crises, many of them a complex mix of social and political upheaval, conflicts and disasters aggravated by a changing climate. We work with and through our partners to address these challenges via three core activities. First, we develop partnerships and projects with regional and global organizations and national stakeholders. Second, we seek and promote more effective ways of working at the global level and in the field. Our aim is not only to reduce needs, but also to create choice and opportunity for vulnerable people. Third, we deploy skilled experts to develop our partners' capacity. Given their independence from the agendas and interests of the organizations they're deployed with, our experts are well placed to identify and address challenges, improve collaboration, and encourage new and innovative approaches. Next, please. In 2019, NORCAP supported roughly 50 partners in 80 countries with 700 deployments. NORCAP has a pool of more than 1,000 professionals recruited to meet the changing demands of a wide range of partners, situations, and crises. We cover the following thematic areas: crisis response, gender and protection, cash and markets, peace building, stabilization, and conflict prevention, and clean energy and climate services. We are today the largest provider of energy expertise to the humanitarian sector. As you may see on this slide, Africa is our highest prioritized region. And with that and these words, I hand it over to Lama, who will present the highlights of NORCAP's energy program. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the NORCAP Energy Project, which is funded by NORAD, started in 2018. The project has three key areas of support. One is improving access to clean energy, which is the most and most of our support goes to. In this area, NORCAP experts work to understand the needs of IDPs, refugees, people of concerns, to identify suitable clean solutions for them. Displaced people, particularly women, girls, and children, are mostly affected group by the lack of energy access. For example, women take average daily walks of 10 kilometers for firewood collection, which exposes them to high protection risks of sexual and gender-based violence. The second area is greening humanitarian operations. Humanitarian agencies still largely depend on diesel generators, which are something transported very long distances by trucks and even airplanes. This comes at a high price of both the operations and the environment. So switching to clean energy sources would save around 21% of the cost and would reallocate the fund to support more people in need. The third one is improving coordination in the sector. We work to strengthen leadership and coordination in the sector. We do this by supporting the Secretariat of the Global Plan of Action for Sustainable Energy Solutions in situations of displacement. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Part of our highlight is part of the project that we are supporting is the biogas facility that we did, that IOM was implemented in Malakal refugee camp in South Sudan that was not working. So IOM sent us a request to send them a biogas expert with a lot of technical and cultural challenges because people were not accepting to use the waste to generate energy from. The facility finally started to work full function. It was a great example of how clean energy can make a positive change, and especially for women who could now cook without polluting smoke or without having to walk long distances to collect firewood. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. The launch, and during 2020, it was the launch of NORCAP Female Accelerator Program. The idea of this program was to reach and maintain gender balance in expert deployment. We have selected 5 junior experts to work with a senior energy expert to build the capacities and to enhance their abilities to work within energy and humanitarian context, to enable them to lead missions in the future by themselves. This approach from our side, we believe it would help to improve the energy services that we are developing for our end users. For example, in the picture you can see Elisha. She's one of our energy experts that is deployed with UNHCR in DRC. She was able to communicate with the women and girls and easily, in an easy way, and to break some of the cultural barriers that would be seen if male experts was talking to them. At last, I would mention, like into 2020, it was a great achievement for us that we were able to increase the female expert support in our roster from 14% at the beginning of the year, reaching 35% until the end of the year. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lama. I think it's my turn to introduce you our report, Empowering Africa Most Vulnerable. We presented the findings of this report last September in Oslo, Norway. Here we try to identify key stakeholders' recommendations to increase the energy access and accelerate the implementation of solar solutions in context of displacements across sub-Saharan Africa. So essentially looking at what the different stakeholders need to do to move this work forward. The white paper is a collaboration between NORCAP and Boston Consulting Group in Norway on a pro bono basis. We are very thankful for this great collaboration. Next. The methodology that we followed here was a combination of stakeholder interviews and desk research. We conducted more than 70 interviews with experts in the topic and stakeholders from across the humanitarian, development, and peace sector. On the right, you can see a non-exhaustive cloud of logos of some of the stakeholders that we have interviewed. In terms of the scope, we have looked at clean energy solutions for powering households, community services, productive uses of livelihoods and for livelihoods and of displaced and host population, and as well as electricity for production for camp operation by humanitarian organization. Next. Now a few words about why we're working on clean energy. Across Africa, 600 million people lack access to electricity. When it comes to displaced people in the continent, as many as 90% lack access to electricity. This has vast implications for issues such as economy, health, communication, food storage, and even people's safety. In addition, obviously, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is absolutely vital if we are to prevent the destruction of livelihoods caused by climate change. The lack of energy is one of the key underlying factors of poverty and inequality, which in turn leads to migration. And then finally, solar power requires slightly higher initial investment than fossil energy, but is generally cheaper in long term in use. So in sum, this could save millions of dollars globally. Now Rebecca is going to talk more about the findings of the report. Please, Rebecca.
Thank you, Borja. So next slide, please. So I would like to start talking about the opportunity with solar. There's been a global push to make humanitarian development and peace building efforts work better together. And this report has confirmed that this is an approach that can definitely help accelerate access to clean energy. So what we see is that there are 3 conditions or enablers that need to be in place for this to work. So we need not only more investments in clean energy, but also pooling of funds. So it's vital that such funds are flexible and can adapt to different contexts in order to enable this transition. Second, we are talking about combining expertise. And by this, we mean having the best from humanitarian development and peace building actors to collaborate better. And in so doing, we can address both immediate and developmental needs. And finally, to secure local buy-in of projects, we believe that all 3 sectors need to combine their expertise, including local and national authorities and communities. So next slide, please. Yes, so with this in mind and through the stakeholder interviews that we conducted for this report, we believe that solar can be the answer to the energy access problems in Africa. So through the research, we identified 4 solar deployment solutions. So first, you can see on the slide, greening humanitarian operations. So essentially replacing traditional fossil-based generators with solar mini-grids for NGO staff and equipment in camps. Secondly, shared service extension, so essentially building out humanitarian mini-grids to also power community services such as schools and hospitals. Thirdly is distributed energy access, so this is delivering electricity directly into households and doing so through, for instance, a solar home system, so on an individual basis. And then finally, mini-grid energy access, and this one is sort of the ultimate ambition that we believe can enable broad energy access for all households in a camp. There's the 5th deployment solution at the bottom of this slide that we called large-scale energy access. This one we identified from utility-scale solar projects, but we did not evaluate this one in detail because it does require a grid connection, which is often not available in rural settings, and also the risks in this type of context sort of hinder the viability of the projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to estimate the potential impact of these deployment solutions, we then developed a scenario that combines the effect of each one of the archetypes that I just showed to you, and doing this across the displaced populations in sub-Saharan Africa. So our scenario shows that up to 9 million displaced and host persons could benefit in some form of energy access through solar. So we are saying that UN agencies and NGOs could lead the way by transitioning from existing diesel generators into solar technologies. And then we sort of believe the natural step being to extend the supply to surrounding community services through shared service extensions. And then from this initial transition, this could serve as a catalyst to develop larger solutions, such as distributed energy systems and larger solar mini-grids. So these 2 being the 3rd and 4th archetype that I showed in the previous slide. And the good news for these scenarios is that it only requires a relatively moderate investment. So we're talking about $50 to $100 per person to deliver all these benefits. Next slide, please. Yes, but transitioning to solar in this context is not without its challenges. And what the report has validated Here I will refer to the top 3, but I encourage you to go back to the report and read a more extended explanation of up to 5 top challenges, long-standing challenges that were validated through the interviews. So first of all, we're talking about how financing needs to become more suitable for solar investments, because we know that current budgets for NGOs and international organizations are usually short-cycled, and this does not match the requirements for solar development, whereas you have an upfront investment and years of lower operational costs. Also, the funding mechanisms are often difficult to access. The second challenge that the white paper confirmed is that there is considerable off-take risk. So in humanitarian context, it is actually challenging to make sure that you have customers, both because NGOs cannot commit to multiple years of off-take, or also displaced persons don't always have the capacity. And the last challenge is that many countries in Africa present difficult political and regulatory landscapes. We've seen, for instance, examples of projects that after years and months of trying to manage the local risks and national requirements, the projects still have been stopped. So that's just as an example. And with this, thank you, and back to you, Borja.
Thank you, Rebecca. In fact, it might seem that delivering energy access to 9 million persons is optimistic, but the early days of the African mobile phone industry illustrates the exponential growth that can be achieved if the right conditions are in place. I'm going to talk only on the 2 first, and I think the business case for mobile phones was already largely proven by the early 2000s, and this is actually the case of solar power. We don't need to prove any new concept here, technologically wise. And then the second will be securing the finance of these investments was not a challenge for the cell phone industry, and it shouldn't be a challenge in the case of solar energy, because we know that funds are available. So we will talk more about that later. So somehow the ambitious picture that Rebecca has shown before is doable. We believe so. Next. So the journey ahead, and summarizing, to address these challenges, we need all stakeholders to act in a coordinated manner to take advantage of everyone's best asset and comparative advantage we have already mentioned before. This requires donors and investors. Investors must establish a common language with international organizations and NGOs to finance projects. Humanitarians need the help of development partners in translating this language from short-term cycle to a long-term view that is required to really tackle these challenges. There are financial mechanisms for that to happen. Second, the clean energy companies should realize, and this is very important for this audience, should realize that solar deployment in displacement settings in sub-Saharan Africa is a sizable opportunity. The opportunity is there. They should partner with NGOs and other humanitarian actors to plan for a longer pipeline of projects, leveraging NGOs' experiences and expertise on the ground and access to local communities and regulators. Third, governments and regulators must ensure that there are policies in place to attract investors and fuel their own national development. I wouldn't go further into that, but because we will talk about that later. And obviously, NGOs and international organizations should try to adopt the triple nexus approach to solve this, putting together humanitarian and development and peace minds together to approach to projects with a more feasible plan and viable outcome. In the page 38 in our report, exhibit 12, you can find some more detailed suggestions in the call to action in the report. And with that, we have reached the end of our presentation of the report, hoping you found it useful. And now, let me take a breath here and let's switch gears into the panel discussion. Please, panelists, you can switch on your cameras. And let me quickly introduce you. I know that some of you don't want this to take so long, but I have to say a few words about you. So we are very lucky to have Mr. Hans Olaf Ibrecht. He's a policy director in the section of energy, climate and food security of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's also a member of the board of the Green Climate Fund, including serving as a chair in 2013 and 2015. Mr. Ibrecht previously worked at the Norwegian Agency for Development and Cooperation, the World Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I will stop there. Thank you very much for being with us today. We also have Susan Huber, Susie. She joins NORCAP Energy Roster in 2019 and is currently deployed to Wolfur Program Regional Office in Nairobi as Energy for Food Security Advisor, working on integrating energy solutions into the programming of the organization throughout the East and Central African region. Her previous experience includes developing a market-based approach to clean cooking in a refugee camp in Rwanda. Susan holds a Master in European and International Law from Leiden University. Thank you, Susie, for being with us today. Let me also introduce Emmanuel Biruriza. He's a renewable energy and energy access expert with more than 15 years in the African continent in development and humanitarian sectors. He has worked for institutions like the African Development Bank. For the past 2 years, he has been working for NORCAP, seconded to UNHCR Tanzania as energy specialist in charge of coordination of the sustainable energy interventions in the humanitarian space. Thank you, Emmanuel, for being here. And last but not least, we have Oidis Gadehot joining us. She has 10 years experience within renewable energy and currently works with the new projects and concepts within Scatec Solar of Norway. Prior to joining the firm in 2016, she has held various positions in the renewable energy company Starcraft within market analysis, trading, and strategy. Thank you, Oidis, for being with us today. Okay, so let's start the discussion. I think I will need the next slide to be on the screen. We are gonna try to cover these major questions. Let's start with the first one, and I would like you to give a brief answer for the beginning about what the lack of clean energy. What is the effect of the lack of clean energy has in displaced and vulnerable population? And I would like to start in order of presentation with Hans Olaf. I'd like you, Hans Olaf, to answer these questions and maybe link it with the SDG goals, the SDG 7, which you are quite knowledgeable about. Please, Hans Olaf.
Thank you, Borja, and thank you very much to NORCAP for organizing this. NORCAP is supported by Norway, as was said in the introduction. I think this is an excellent program. It's highly relevant, but of course, although having said this, we also expect that the humanitarian agencies are now themselves giving priority to energy in humanitarian settings and allocating their own resources to it also, especially with the strong business case that has been presented. This is a $1.6 billion market, so there's a huge opportunity and upside here. So I'm hoping that the NORCAP program will be successful in raising the overall agenda here. I think that's really important. I think we all know why energy is so important for us. You, Borja, presented an interesting figure, the uptake of mobile telephones. And this is something I've been looking at as well, but in field of energy, access to electricity and clean cooking, we are far off the curve that you presented to us. It is a wish that we would follow that curve, but we are definitely not there. The fact is that about 800 million lack access to electricity, almost 600 million in Africa. 1 in 4 health clinics don't have adequate electricity, and in clean cooking, it's just, I'm tempted to use it's dismal and terrible. It's a complete failure from all of us that 2.8 billion and almost 4 billion people, almost half of the world's population, don't have acceptable access to cooking fuels. And this is just this is totally unacceptable with all the development impacts that this is being caused. Of course, we can look at deforestation, climate change, the health impacts. 4 million people die annually prematurely because of indoor air pollution. Again, totally unacceptable, and this is something we need to do more about. Renewable energy, only 17% in the global energy consumption is from renewable, 25% in electricity, and we need then to double and triple investments. And then the question, of course, how do we double or triple? We're always pointing at the private sector, which has or contributes about 85% of global investments in clean energy, of which it's about 600 billion altogether, of which about half is for renewable energy. But if you look at Africa, the continent that we are now dealing with, only have between $1 to $7 billion in investments in renewable energy per year, and half of this is in South Africa. On average, about 12 to 15 African countries receive investments totaling more than $10 million. So again, for me, the conclusion of this is that we've had a great focus on private sector, rightly so, but now we also need to balance this out to get the public sector right. So we need to focus on the 3 T's, that's tariffs, taxes, and transfers. We need to get the tariffs right, cost-reflective tariffs. We need to, of course, set up the right tax system so governments will get resources. And of course, we need to look at the transfer side, which is ODA and public global climate finance. So we need to get the public side right. Then I think the private sector will come in immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans Olav. Very, very insightful data that you're bringing here to start the conversation. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question to Susie. You have experience and exposure to what entails not to have access to energy in vulnerable people for settings. Could you expand your view on what entails not having energy for food security and nutrition? Susie.
Thank you, Borja. Yeah, I think I'm working at WFP Regional Bureau Nairobi, so we cover 10 different countries in East and Central Africa. And what we've seen in terms of the lack of energy in humanitarian settings is that it's really a question of survival. It's mostly the lack of clean and sufficient cooking fuel that is most worrying because it causes so many negative impacts, not just on people's lives, but also in terms of conflict with host communities. There's a real struggle for resources when it comes to big movements of people. And if there isn't enough access to energy, particularly for cooking, it really becomes a question of survival for a lot of people. So what we see is that they actually skip meals because they don't have enough fuel to cook their meals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know that the challenge is quite difficult for the people in need. I'd like to also hear the voice of Emmanuel. Emmanuel, you have quite a exposure of the refugees in Tanzania. I'd like to also switch gears a little bit in what is also the challenge of green humanitarian operations. What that could help in delivering access to the final people. What have you seen in the sector happening in that sense?
Well, thank you very much. First, before I actually answer that question, I have to give a little bit of a snapshot of an overview of what is the situation in energy space in the humanitarian aspect. As Susan said, and Hans as well, there's a lot of marginal services when it comes to energy services, and that brings all sort of issues. And speaking of problems of energy for cooking, conflict with the host community, not only with the host community, but also conflict with authorities of the host country, and that actually jeopardizes, the goodwill of so many governments of inviting, the displaced communities. So I think one of the things that should be looked at very clearly is for the humanitarian actors and partners to now try to think through as energy being one of the very important aspects in protection space during planning the emergency issues. But going back to the greening aspect, we find most of the many of the operations, they do lack clean electricity. By that I mean there is no even grid electricity in the camps. Looking at the Tanzania example, we have 3 camps hosting more than 320,000 people, but then there is no electricity. And in that case, they do depend entirely on expensive diesel fuel. And that has got all sorts of issues. You can easily talk of emissions. If you speak of diesel gensets, the diesel gensets are not well sized, so most of them are very inefficient. And by being inefficient, they cannot even provide the service that they are required. In Tanzania, we have close to 100 gensets running. So it's very important now to think of how to really switch from dependence on fossil fuel towards relatively clean energy. I can talk more later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel. Yes, I think we have looking at an issue that is quite important. One data that we have from the report is that 90% of the rapes that occur in a refugee camp in Chad, in Fuchana refugee camp in Chad, were caused by just the need of energy gathering, that the women need to go outside the refugee camp. So actually energy is also a protection issue. And sometimes we tend to forget these kind of issues. But let me follow up with what is, and actually probably jumping into the second question that we have. So what is the role for the private sector here? And now I would like to address this question to Oidis, because Scatec Solar has been quite in the front run of providing clean energy to humanitarian operations. And I think that the case of the Malakal camp in South Sudan is a great example. You are setting the way, you're paving the way for some others partners to jumping in this opportunity. What is the role of the private sector here? What do you think, Oidis?
First, thanks a lot for having me here, and thanks for having this very important and very interesting discussion with such a good group of people. I think there are quite a few interesting aspects on the role that private companies can take in this type of segment. Just bringing first attention to the point that Hans Olav made, that in Africa the private investments are quite few compared to other places in renewable energy. And that's being an active and being the biggest solar company in Africa, though with a focus in South Africa, we know very well what you're talking about. And one of the challenges in that regard is, of course, related to the guarantees that you will need to put in place to put such large investments into the country. And that's really what we've been trying to do with this solution that we have developed and that we are now implement for Malakal and trying to expand over Africa, a solution that is movable and that allows us to get around the whole guarantee structure that we're typically struggling with taking years and years of negotiation to get in place. So that's from the utility and the large scale side. But when it comes to also power for everyone and to getting power out to every single person around and also vulnerable populations, it's a very interesting way to go through the humanitarian operations. I think it's an interesting aspect that there's a lot of capital out there. Many people are interested in, and that's a good thing about 2020. There's a lot of capital going into renewable energy this year. there's the technology is readily in place. And there are two things that I would consider the challenges or where we need to put even more effort. One is with regards to, again, the guarantee structure, like Rebecca mentioned, in terms of off-taker and making sure that you get your investment back one way or another with an uncertain structure with this type of off-takers. The other point that I think is really important is also the role of the humanitarian organizations in this type of thing, using humanitarian sector setting or using humanitarian operations who have a solid base as an anchor client, which is what we're doing in Malakal and what we will be doing other places, to get our feet on the ground and to kind of get started in an area. That's so much easier to start from there and to get going than to start from scratch. So I think that role is really important, and that the organizations dare to say, okay, we want to do this, we're leaning forward and then working together with us to find the solution, because the financing is there, the technology is there. It's really just about sitting together and finding the right format at this point.
Mm-hmm. No, that's excellent. This is the concept of the anchor client is really, really key here, and I think the report that we presented earlier made a point on that too. So thank you for stressing that out. I would like to also because the private sector has been called in the last many years to get a stronger role in shifting this the transition to energy, to clean energy. But what is the modern, the nowadays role of governments? Why governments are sometimes creating some difficulties, at least in the settings that we are talking about, refugees, displacement, people, vulnerable people, and including the host communities that serves them. Hans Olaf, I know that you have an opinion on how what the governments could do. I know Norway is doing quite a lot now, supporting so many different programs, including NORCAP, a program on energy. What else can be done?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure whether I have the answer to your question, but I will try a little bit also to building on what Eidis just said, because I think you mentioned it yourself also, to use refugee camps as anchor clients in some areas. But for us, taking one step back, of course, renewable energy is a priority within our development cooperation program, as well as humanitarian support. Of course, our challenge is to build a bridge between the humanitarian short-term and the long-term development assistance, which we have to be honest, we are not very good about doing, because that's the one-year budget compared to 3, 4, 5-year programs, and that's something missing. We are working on the guarantee issues. We are just about to establish a guarantee mechanism. It has been somewhat delayed because everything takes time in my business, and then a little bit more time. So we are not slow to respond because of all the processes that we are working on. And then I'm really pleased that the humanitarian agencies and the humanitarian sector, if I can call it that, has now taken up this clean energy challenge by UNHCR. And by all means, we coming from the SDG 7 side, of course, the humanitarian agencies also have to address SDG 7, which is providing this essential service to all by 2030. When I started, I think the target was 80%, but of course we couldn't send a message that only 80% of refugees should get access to service. No, this is 100%, and we have to deliver. And I think the only way of delivering is that we all work together and develop the necessary partnerships in order to get this scaling up. I was really pleased what you said, Iris. The money is there, technology is there. Now it's a matter for us to get together and roll up our sleeves and get going. So thank you.
Thank you, Ansola. I know that Susie and Emmanuel has extensive experience dealing with the governments, local governments, looking at this opportunity from a different perspective. Emmanuel, do you mind to share some of your experience in how you have confronted sometimes government regulation in the case in Tanzania, for example, and how do you think that this could be changed in the future, and what are your learnings there?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of government involvement is very interesting, especially looking at locations like in Tanzania. These host governments have got their own vision on how to deal with different issues and development aspects, etc., even humanitarian sector. So sometimes what we plan, they are not necessarily in line with their policies and priorities. And that can bring a lot of challenge in selling the different ideas. And it becomes even much more difficult if there's some form of political process for which you are planning something. They have to be part of the process and they have to give their opinion, and so that you can be able to not waste time, but do something which is right, not only to the displaced community, but also to the host community. If you don't mind, I can also add from what Hans actually just responded when it comes to issues or even issues of the private sector. I can also talk about the challenges with the private sector is also in line with the model for which to involve private sector. And in that, actually, we can cite the model, for example, the PPA, the power purchase agreements, if you want to put a larger infrastructure. And speaking of humanitarian organizations, their planning cycle is on emergence fashion. So they are only doing it in 1 year. So if you bring private sector with a notion of making money and making some profits, then the shorter duration of the PPA is really challenging. But also the uncertainty of the existence of the so-called anchor population, the refugees. If the next day the government decides to close all the camps, which is not expected anyway, but it is a risk for which the private sector is also very much mindful of. And so the policy aspect of the government, but also the uncertainty of the existence of the camps and the PPA duration, those are quite key when it comes to involving private sector.
Okay, no, it's very interesting feedback. I was wondering, Susie, could you also share some of your experience with governments and how they interlink with the private sector from your experience, from your past experience that you have? What do you think that has to happen for governments to look at refugees as an opportunity rather than something that they don't know how to handle very well, and how can also, in a way, a humanitarian challenge become a development challenge? Thinking on the triple nexus and all this.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in the East and Central African region that we cover is that there is actually a movement of governments and the recognition that a lot of the displacement situations that we're seeing in this region are protracted. So they're no longer emergency responses, but some of these camps in some of the countries have actually been hosting refugees for 20 years plus. So this is a generation that we're talking about that's growing up in these humanitarian settings where, yes, the humanitarian agencies have planning cycles of 1 year, and yet you're facing a situation that is not going to change within the next year anymore. So what we're seeing is that there are actually governments that are seeing the opportunity of refugee camps in situations to bridge the humanitarian development divide. So we're seeing that, for example, in Kenya, we're seeing that in Uganda, we're seeing that in Ethiopia, where the government is recognizing, wow, there's all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, because they've been there for quite a while, but there's a large group of people who are receiving a lot of aid and assistance. How do we integrate that aid and assistance into their own development agenda for that region? Then it starts to become an opportunity. And it starts to become exactly what we're trying to achieve, which is dividing that humanitarian development divide and achieving that triple nexus. So if you start to look at the host community, you look at it much more holistically. What can we do in order to achieve energy access? And so then it becomes more interesting for the private sector to enter those markets, because we have to see them as markets at that point. There's actually a lot of activity happening around those refugee camps. There's been studies done where the host communities, where it's been shown that, you know, the refugee camps actually bring market opportunities to the host community as well. And so really the role of the government at that point, together with the humanitarian agencies and development agencies, is to give clarity about what the situation brings. If politically, you know, these refugee situations are only meant to be there for a few years, then the private sector should know that. There should be clarity on that. The idea is this refugee camp shuts down in 5 years. The private sector can deal with that. There are technological solutions that are temporary. And so, you know, it's really up to all of us to just create the parameters that allows for all the different solutions that are possible, whether very long-term or short-term.
Thank you, Susie. To finish, and before going to the question and answer session, I'd like you to give me to think about one thing that you are missing in the landscape that you would like to see. And I think by appellation, I would say Odis could start with just a 1 minute answer on what are you missing in the sector to really see more change from a private sector perspective.
Well, I think one place where we are eager to see even more engagement is actually within the humanitarian organizations themselves. And that's really a place where it's natural for us to start. As I mentioned, it's difficult to go out and try to deliver to a refugee camp before you know how many people they are, how long they will be there for, etc. Like Susie also touched upon. But I think really getting the engagement of the organizations on the ground that are able to pay for the power, who knows how much they will have, who has some kind of security towards us, that's a really good starting point. So once we have the humanitarians on board, I would be thrilled to get the projects going.
Wonderful, wonderful. Manuel, what would you like to see in less than 1 minute? What would you like to see more often and on the ground?
Well, I think that it's, you know, the humanitarian organizations, I think it's high time now to treat energy as a humanitarian sector and something that should not be looked at as a, as a subsidiary to the protection space. It's a core in protection. You speak of SDBV, you speak energy. You speak of health, you speak energy. You speak of shelter, etc., you speak energy. So it's high time to now treat energy as one of the pillars in protection space.
Thank you, Manuel. Susie, what would you say that you would like to see?
I mean, very much going on what Emmanuel just said about humanitarian agencies, seeing energy as a protection issue and not necessarily as a separate topic to be addressed after we've dealt with, you know, saving lives. I would like to see energy as part of the saving lives agenda that we've been tasked with. But beyond that, what I would really like to see is these refugee camps being integrated in livelihoods programs that include energy solutions. I feel as though without energy, there won't be livelihoods, we won't have time savings. You know, this is something that we're looking forward to working on. Thanks.
Thank you, Susie. And Hans-Ola, I think I'm going to use you as a transition for the question. First, you will say your wish. What would you like to see more in this sector? But also, we got this question number 1 from the audience. If you believe that COVID-19 will unite energy and humanitarian efforts now more than ever, resulting in real change or not? And probably a follow-up question on that. But please go ahead, give your wish, and then the answer to this question.
just to try to summarize what my colleagues said, I think what we need to clarify is actually who owns this agenda, whose problem is it, and who can actually solve it. I agree that the humanitarian agencies themselves have to give priority to this, because they cannot just expect that we, the long-term guys, will take care of it, or the energy sector will take care of it. The humanitarian actors need to own this agenda and move it forward, and then we can help to build get the public sector right, and then I'm quite sure that Scatec and similar companies will step up to the plate and deliver, because they have the capital and the technology, and then we have the partnerships. COVID-19, it's a great, I shouldn't use that word because it's not the right word to use, but it's an opportunity that we cannot miss out of using. COVID-19 is a health and economic and I would say emotional crisis that needs to be addressed. Of course, first saving lives. We need now to develop and distribute vaccines. We know some of the vaccines need cold storage, even 90 or 70 to 80 degrees below zero. How can we actually distribute that without electricity, without energy? So the answer is quite evident. I think the crisis has also demonstrated the importance of reliable electricity. I don't think even in Norway I can sit and participate in any virtual meeting without someone dropping off the line. It's not because of electricity, because of bandwidth or whatever. We don't even have our system in place to really function without reliable electricity. If you look at the green stimulus or the packages, 10 trillion rescue packages have been put on the table. The green amount of that is very small. I think that is the missed opportunity, that now we seem to be doing the same as we have done before. If we can turn some of these 10 trillions into greener efforts, I think we would be on the right track. If not, COVID-19 will also have as an impact that we will lose out on some of the development gains that we have already reaped. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is a question to Oidis. How could the public sector help unlock different kinds of finance options, such as climate finance for clean energy in displacement settings, given the mitigating and adaptation effect of it? So what would you think the public sector has to help with unlocking the options?
Thanks for the question, first of all. No, I think providing for the public sector, I think providing a stable framework, providing stability and support for the projects and for so that it's a stable environment, or as stable as possible to go into, I think is probably the most important role that the public sector can play in this space. There is a lot of climate development financing. Many would really like to go in here. So I think it's really about, just as you guys have also pointed out at several occasions, making all the right people sit down together and find the solution in that particular space. And the public sector really has a role on the ground on the overall framework there. And then there's plenty of institutions and other sectors who have their mandate to support in other ways. And I think they're ready to do so.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have running out of time here. I would like to also give you the opportunity to, if anyone has something else to add, including Stina, please do so. Otherwise, I think we are short in time. Stina, do you want to, anyone has something else to add in the last minute? Wonderful. So I guess that we can conclude this panel. I would like to thank you all again for your participation. I think this is a debate that can last many more hours, but unfortunately we are limited in the time, but not in the ideas and experience that we have shown here. Thank you again to all of you. And now it's time for Stina to maybe add some closing remarks. Please, Stina.
Thank you, Borja. So we know today that there is an immediate need to address the widening energy access gap impacting vulnerable populations in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've heard today that half of Africa's continent lack access to electricity. And this represents a huge gap to our joint international ambition, where all persons have access to accessible, sustainable, and modern energy by 2030. The challenge, as we see it, is twofolded. We must close the energy gap with renewable energy at the same time as replacing fossil energy with renewable energy sources to protect our planetary boundaries. So, do you think it's possible? Many still refuse that renewable energy can replace fossil energy. But then let us be reminded that many of the developments we today consider core to progress were indeed refuted before it happened with arguments that it was not possible. For instance, child labor was a recognized pillar of the Victorian economy and prevailed well into the 20th century Europe. There were also more than 60 years from the first campaigns for women's rights in the UK to the establishment of equal voting rights in 1928. Safety belts were proposed in 1930 and took until 1970s to become mandatory in cars. So each of these transitions came to struggle with short-term realism and lack of perspective. The same is applicable when responding to climate change and need to transition to renewable energy sources. Well, I am confident it is possible and that we will do this. I hope that we will do it within 5 to 10 years and not 40 or 100. So we have no time to lose, but we have so much to lose. NORCAP and BCG have shown in our report that it is possible to deliver clean energy to over 9 million displaced and host persons in sub-Saharan Africa through an accelerated solar deployment, and that this in turn can have catalytic effects on the growth of electrification of displaced and host communities, and again to high impact larger projects. To enable the transition to clean energy, we need, as we heard today, concerted action from many stakeholders, especially international organizations, national and local governments, the private sector, and international financial institutions, donors, and investors. We are therefore very happy that so many of you have been part of this session and debate, and also to say that, as we've heard today, clean energy represents a sizable market opportunity. We've also heard that most crises are protracted, and that therefore we must have longer-term solutions, and that collaboration between the private sector and humanitarian organizations are a good place to start, and that the humanitarian sector must take ownership also to this agenda, but also that there are donors willing to support from the public sector side. So I think we've heard very inspiring perspectives today and success stories on how to provide clean energy from the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, from Scatec Solar, the World Food Programme, and also the High Commissioner for Refugees. So in closing, we salute your future leadership on this, and we look forward to collaborating with you and other stakeholders achieving the clean energy transition. So thank you very much.